Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. This episode releases 2 weeks before the Gallifrey 1 convention in Los Angeles. I will be at Galley this year. I'll be speaking at 2 panels on the Friday, and you can find those in the program book. If you're there and you're a listener, come over and say hi. Hoping to record a couple of episodes worth of material there, so I will look forward to getting that out to you after the convention is over. This week, we are looking at the last book of the year 1980, Terrance Dicks' novelization of the Monster of Peladon. The book is the novelization of the TV serial that is a sequel to The Curse of Peladon, which we discussed all the way back in episode 11 of this podcast. Last week's guest, the great Ross Aitken, was also my guest for that episode way back in the very infancy of this show. My copy of Monster of Peladon is a second edition. The original came out in 1980, but the second edition was not until 1984. Some other Target books were up to their 4th or 5th printing by now, so you can imagine this might not have been one of the line's best sellers. I got my copy at Barnes & Noble, rather than the Walden Books where I got most of my novelizations in the mid-1980s. Ask me how I know that. The distinctive Barnes & Noble price sticker was slapped onto the cover of the book, partially covering up both Agador and the Ice Warrior. The sticker has faded and at this point pretty much is just directly part of the cover now. If I were to peel the sticker off, I'm quite positive that the serial codes and price would remain on the cover, forever stained in permanent ink. It is an excellent cover painting by Steve Kyte, and it's a shame that the Barnes & Noble clerk in the mid-1980s saw fit to put the sticker right over there, as opposed to the back cover where it would traditionally belong, but there you have it. My guest this week is Joe Short, who I've met from Twitter. Happy to say that this is Joe's very first appearance on a podcast anywhere. Unfortunately, as these things sometimes happen, Joe had a lot of trouble with her equipment on the day of recording. We had a limited amount of time in which to record. She had technical issues. I had a brief internet dropout at one point. And unfortunately, our conversation is going to be much, much shorter than the usual interviews that you get on the show. We did not have time to play a game. It would have been 20 questions, by the way. You will also note that the interview essentially cuts out in mid-sentence, and unfortunately there was no way for us to go back and revisit or re-record, which is a shame because Joe came prepared. She had extensive notes on the text. You will hear that she is funny, she is erudite, she has a degree in literature and is not afraid to use it. And she taught me a lot of things about the book that I had not considered. So it's a very, very fun conversation, and hopefully you will get to hear a lot more of her on other podcasts in the weeks and months and years to come. So let's get to it.
Hi, I'm Rupert Booth.
I am known as Paul Ferry.
And my name is Barry Williams.
Together, we host Time Ram.
Time Ram's a cruel mistress.
It's a random number generator.
That also.
We roll a number from 1 to 13, and that's our doctor. Then 1 to 300 for the story, and then we ram them together.
Even if it doesn't make sense.
Cruel, I tell you.
Time Ram, putting the wrong doctors in the wrong stories, so you don't have to.
You're listening to Doctor Who Literature.
Most of the guests on Doctor Who Literature are old friends of mine or people in the business or people that I've known for years or decades. However, I do like to mix it up and occasionally give people their podcast debut. And today we have a first time appearance, not only on Doctor Who literature, but on any podcast ever before, ever. Joe, why don't you say hello to everybody?
Hi, everybody.
So, Joe, you and I came to meet on Twitter as we both share the same extended Twitter circles. Give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself on Twitter and to Doctor Who fandom and how you come to be here today.
I'm on Twitter as the Brain of Spock, which might give people a clue as to one of my other loves of science fiction. I've worked out the other day that I was born during season 6B, so that shows you how old I am. My first Doctor Who memories, there's three very clear ones. It's the maggots in the Green Death. It's Lynx taking his helmet off in the Time Warrior. And I was made to go to a family wedding instead of being allowed to watch the final episode of The Invasion of Dinosaurs, which has been a bugbear of mine for nearly 50 years now. So I wasn't really into Doctor Who for a very long time. I mean, it was always sort of in the zeitgeist. I mean, everybody knew about Doctor Who. The next big science fiction thing I got into was Star Trek. I love me a bit of Star Trek, especially Deep Space Nine. That's my absolute favourite. And then it was Peter Capaldi that drew me back into Doctor Who. I just love him. And that was sort of my and then getting onto Twitter and then just finding all the other people on there that seem to like Doctor Who as well. And here I am.
How did you come to have a Twitter handle after a rather infamous season 3 original Star Trek episode?
Oh, because I love it. It's terrible, but I love it. I mean, it's kitsch and camp and completely ridiculous, but why not? So sometimes I look at it now and I think, oh, good God, why did I get that on there? And sort of, but it's memorable.
That it certainly is.
Memorable. So that was how I got into that. And then it sort of, once lockdown hit, I really got into podcasts and sort of they became sort of a real lifeline, I think, for a lot of people. You know, they started doing them or they had more time to listen to them. So that was sort of how I ended up here.
Yeah, this podcast was sort of a pandemic project for me as well. So luckily the pandemic brought us together. So it seems as if with you being born when you were, John Pertwee would have been your very first Doctor.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Somewhere in my house, I have a copy of the Radio Times 10th anniversary special, which I must have pestered my parents to buy me at a quite young age. So, no, he's always been my classic Doctor. So, and I still love him today. I think he's, you know, to me, I know a lot of younger people say it's Tom Baker, but for me, I think you always have a great sort of love for the first Doctor you ever saw, and certainly with me, yeah.
My first, of course, was Peter Davison, and then Tom Baker after that. So I came into John Pertwee a little bit later in my fandom, but he quickly became one of my favorites for reasons that I've talked about at length on earlier episodes. We are now talking about his second to last story, Monster of Peladon, from 1974, the spring. Would you have seen this when it first went out, and do you have any distinct memories of it from early 74?
I probably did watch it. I mean, if I'd watched all of sort of the beginning of season 11, I must have seen this, but I have no sort of very clear memory. It's not a sort of I have of the sort of the earlier part of the season, but it's all been a great surprise looking back on it now. So
when did you first start reading the novelizations?
as again, it's quite recently, really. I was very with the sort of love of Star Trek. I've read probably a lot more Star Trek novels than I have Doctor Who ones. I've just read loads of them, including sort of the earlier ones and the later on ones, sort of as the series came out. I used to work for Blockbuster Video, so
Oh my goodness!
I know. I spent actually, I got the job because the people who interviewed me love Star Trek, so it's very good to be nerd sometimes. So, you can get jobs for it. And and then sort of, I haven't really, read. I have since started to read a lot more of the Target novels. I get hold of them, and sort of like there's been ones that I really love. I mean, I love the Demons. I think Barry Letts is a great writer. I've even read, I can tell you how much I love Barry Letts. I even read The Island in Space.
Which one is that? I know he did a couple of books for the BBC line about 20 years ago.
It's one of those. It's the one that they did the radio production of with Pertwee and Nicholas Courtney and Liz Sladen.
Oh, you mean Paradise of Death, right?
Which everybody. Oh, not Paradise of Death. The other one, the sequel to that.
Oh, The Ghost of N-Space.
That's the one. Yeah, I've even read that. So.
Because he also did a book called Island of Death, which I have not read. But yeah, Paradise of Death was almost a breaking point for me in fandom. After I read Paradise of Death, I almost gave it all up. But fortunately, I came back.
Oh dear. Well, never mind. I read the In Space one is not as bad as everybody had led me to believe. So, and yeah, so I like his books. I like Ian Marter's books. I love our Malcolm Holt books. But I'm sort of getting my way into reading the novels, which sort of your podcast has actually sort of spurred me on to do so. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's terrific. Glad to hear that. Thank you.
Yep. Uh-huh.
When would you have first read this week's book, Monster of Peladon, from December 1980?
About a week after we discussed doing it. I went onto eBay. I got my lovely colour copy.
Oh my goodness! There it is.
There we go.
I have the exact same cover. I have the 1984 edition, but it's the same distinctive cover art.
No, this is the first. This is the 1980 one. So
this was not one of Target's biggest sellers because the second edition didn't come out until 1984.
I can imagine. Our good friend Fraser, who I promised to mention the Dominators on, even though you threatened to chuck me off this podcast if I did it.
Yeah, that'll wrap it up for this week. That'll wrap it up for us this week. Thanks very much for joining us. Have a great night.
Okay, bye. Yeah. I asked him. He's got the copy of the On Target book because I saw he had it on Twitter, and I said to him, "Can you tell me what they say about the Monster of Peladon booking that?" Thinking there might be something. And he went, they said Terrance Dicks wrote it, and that was it. I thought, I thought, oh dear, that says something, doesn't it? So, but it's not as bad as that.
I, of course, am doing my audio essay about the book at the end of this episode, and again, the TV story is kind of a mess because Brian Hales' scripts were not workable, and Terrance had to rewrite it from scratch himself at a time when he also had Robot, which was being written for production because Robot is produced right after this, and he was also working on the first batch of novelizations from 1974. So you can imagine if he didn't have a lot of bandwidth left to write Monster of Peladon. I think, and the point this is that I'll make later, I think the novelization is much better than the TV story because it has a little more room to breathe.
And you don't have to look at the you don't have to look at the weeks. I think everybody, if you say Monster of Peladon to sort of Doctor Who fans, I think they say, "Oh, wigs and tunnels and Alpha Centauri," and that sort of three things that you can sort of beat the story to death for with. And when you look at the season as a whole, I mean, you've got it was really sort of, it was probably a cost saver because they had the costumes already and the sets. And you look at sort of the scale of the others of that season, they're very sort of ambitious. It must have cost quite a lot. And this was definitely a sort of a money-saving episode. I would gather. I would think it would be, just by the fact that it's it's all studio bound. They don't have to make new costumes and sort of that sort of thing. So, but the book's a lot better. I enjoyed the book. I really did. So
That was kind of the genius of Barry Letts as a producer, because he was able to make the show 26 weeks a year with fancy week-long location shoots, and then mixing that with studio-bound stories. This is the same year where they were on location for Planet of the Spiders. Robot was filmed at the same time as Planet of the Spiders, and that was done on outdoor broadcast video, which I don't believe Doctor Who had used before. Invasion of the Dinosaurs, of course, you have the location shoot and the very lavish dinosaur props and effects. So Monster of Peladon would have been the budget saver of the year, because as you say, they already had the Ice Warrior costumes from the 60s. They already had the Alpha Centauri costume, and I don't imagine they still would have had the sets, but they would have had the blueprints, so it would have been easy to remount those sets.
So, well, it's only sort of one tunnel and two doors, really. So, so even so, what they managed to achieve is remarkable. Sort of 10p and some sticky tape. They managed to churn out something fantastic.
So for you, of course, once we're reading the books, we can forget about whatever behind-the-scenes problems hampered the making of the TV story. So we don't have to worry about the fact that there's only one tunnel, or Ice Warrior costumes that were in a very serious state of disrepair and never ever got used again after this story. And we can forgive all that, because now we're just reading what Terrance pictured in his head as he was rewriting the scripts.
Yeah.
So what for you are the high points of the novelization?
I love the way he managed to sum up sort of the plot and history of what happens in literally like a page and a half. Because I read the Curse of Peladon as well, sort of to get a comparison. They're very different beasts, but I can understand why kids loved these books. I can really understand why they did it. I mean, Terrance doesn't write down to people. I mean, there are words here that I had to look up, and I've got an English degree, so he doesn't sort of talk down to people, especially the kids who were the target, if you excuse the pun. You could say it's a very sort of repetitive story, because it's the plot, it's like, Agador's about who's using him to get nefarious deeds done. I like the sort of political machinations. I mean, it was very much from the time when it was both on TV, because I remember all the sort of industrial action that was going on at the time it was broadcast, and then Mrs. Thatcher had just come into power when this was written as a novel, so once again there was a lot of sort of anti-European, anti-workers' rights sort of going on. So he really he can bring that in as well, and I love he's got some really good turns of phrase. I mean, he uses there's a lot of alliteration. There's some really nice sort of language and sort of phraseology, and it was a lot better than. As again, I'm not probably the audience it was aimed at, because I'm a lot older, and unfortunately, I think I think it improves. It's much better than the series is. I mean, he's really sort of tightened it all up and sort of made it a lot sort of more coherent, I think. So
Comparing this to the novelization of Curse of Peladon, which we talked about
Yeah.
on this show all the way back in episode
Mhm.
11, have you had a chance to compare the two side by side? And if so, how do you think Terrance handles his prose compared to the way that Brian Hales handled the prose back when he adapted the original version of Peladon?
I can't really remember the post, but with this one, I think you can say, I mean, God bless Uncle Terrance. He wrote 10 books in a year.
Oh, that's right.
It makes me feel tired even thinking of reading 10 books in a year some days. So I think he can be forgiven for the sort of like some of the sort of, if you say, oh, he does script a page, and that's sort of like, that's sort of an insult that's been heard at him. But I think he would be quite justified to have done it at this point in the writing process. I think, sort of, he could have literally just shut it on with a sort of he said, she said bits in it. And I think no one would have said, what are you doing? But the Brian Hales one, from what I remember, is a lot more densely written. But then again, he probably had a lot more time to write it. And they were his characters after all. So, Terrance was playing in somebody else's sort of sandpit with his characters. So, but even though he thoroughly knew them, having worked on the show, but
I'm glad you said that about Terrance because he has often been accused of doing mere script-to-screen transfers, and the whole point of the first 62 episodes of this podcast has been to explode that myth and show that it is not remotely true. And going all the way back to episode 4, we have talked quite a bit here about how Terrance does a lot more than you think, because he is always commenting on the story, riffing on the story, adding scenes, subtracting scenes, reordering scenes, adding plot hole fixes. So this is actually Terrance Dicks' farewell to us as the series regular, right? Because he did a metric ton of books between episodes 4 and 62. After this, he only comes back a few times a year. He's no longer the principal author of the line. He is no longer writing more than half the books in any calendar year. He is no longer writing more than half the books for any season after 17, which aired just before this book came out. So this is pretty much it for Terrance. We'll still have him on the show to talk about his books, but there'll be a lot less of them going forward. So this is a good point to, I think, reflect back and talk about what a remarkable job he did writing so many books a year under such time crunch circumstances while also having a day job at the BBC and making television.
Oh God, yes. I mean, I think we've all had to have writing deadlines for things, and you're thinking, my God, we've all had essays to meet in or reports to hand over, and just think what he was actually doing. And this was all pre-computer age, so it was all typed out. He could sort of cut and paste all over the place. He didn't have access, he probably only had access to the scripts. It's remarkable what he did. Absolutely incredible. He really should be sort of praised to the heavens for it. Thankfully he is. I think more people are sort of. I think not nowadays. I think it's very easy to sort of still sort of look down on people who write sort of books based on science fiction. I mean, probably not as much as it was, but because there's you get some incredible, I think sort of, when you think you've got people like Neil Gaiman writing science fiction stuff, but Terrance, he should be praised to the heavens for what he did and what he managed to achieve at the time he did it. So, all kudos to him.
And considering how many children he got reading in England and the UK and beyond.
I mean, books are my passion. I mean, I love books. I've got an English degree. I qualified as a librarian, so books and book-related things are my absolute love. And anything that gets kids reading. Especially, there's always a huge worry about boys reading as well. And you think he must have had a massive impact. Well, you only have to see the people. I was listening to another podcast today about about him, and the amount of people who not only write and do Doctor Who related material, but probably in other things. The amount of people who said he was an influence on their writing, it's incredible. It's incredible the sort of legacy that he's left. Not only for sort of, his television work and his novels, but just for sort of getting people to read. I mean, that's an amazing legacy to have. It's incredible. So,
And of course,
all hail Terrance.
not every book is going to be the Auton invasion. Not every book is going to be Talons of Wang Chiang. He's not going to be able to knock it out of the park every single time, but given what he's working with, I think there's a lot to praise even about this book. And of course, this is the last time he does 10 books a year. So hopefully his life is going to get a lot easier going forward in the life of this podcast.
Yeah, I hope he had a really good Christmas that year. I really do. I hope he had, he probably slept for all of it. But I hope he had, a really good time after he'd, sent this manuscript off. So.
And of course, he doesn't get much of a say in terms of cover or art design, but this is one of the few books with a green spine, and it's got an amazing cover painting. So this book certainly looks great, if nothing else.
Yeah, I'm a bit disappointed that Alpha Centauri's not on the front, but perhaps for reasons. I mean,
Given the reaction in studio to the original appearance of the Alpha Centauri prop, it's probably a good thing that Alpha Centauri was not on the cover. That would have put this book in a very different part of the bookshop and not the children's section.
No, you'd probably have to get someone tall to get it down off the top shelf for you. Or you'd be selling it in a brown paper wrapper or something. So.
That's a great way of putting it. All right, Joe, we're running out of time on the Zoom call. Quickly, where else can our listeners find you, and what other podcast appearances might you have in store coming up?
I'm on Twitter as the Brain of Spock. That's basically where I am because I don't really do Facebook or anything else. I have been talking to our lovely friend Joe Ford for absolutely ages about going on to the Hamster Pod and standing up for Sleep No More. So hopefully we'll sort that out in the near future because I am crazy enough to stand up and say I really like it.
Somebody has to stand up for Sleep No More, and it's certainly not going to be me.
And it's going to be me. Oh, it's going to be me. So
I will say in defense of Mark Gatiss, among his many, many other accomplishments, the Peladon stories were a huge influence on him, and he's the guy who brought Alpha Centauri back into the new series. So I can forgive Sleep No More because of everything else Mark Gatiss has done for us.
Yeah. Oh, no, I have a real fondness for all these stories, and I'm quite surprised.
And unfortunately, that was where the interview cut off, and we were not able to reestablish for another session. So, much like the episode Sleep No More itself, we are going to end on a rather unsatisfying cliffhanger. Although, unlike Sleep No More, hopefully that cliffhanger will be resolved at some point, perhaps during a repeat appearance. Anyway, Jo will be on other podcasts hopefully soon, so please do follow her on Twitter and check that out. That means, unfortunately, this is going to be a short episode. What follows, my audio essay, is an adaptation of my previously written review of Monster of Peladon. It is not what Cultbox calls one of my quote-unquote forensic deep dives into the text. I'll be having one of those a couple of weeks from now, but for a lot of the episodes in this run of books, I do have pre-written reviews, so I am adapting and updating those, and those tend to run a little bit shorter than some of my longer essays, such as the one that I wrote for Doctor Who and the War Games back in episode 50, for example. So sit back, and for the next 15 minutes, please enjoy my review of the novelization of Doctor Who and the Monster of Peladon. Doctor Who and the Monster of Peladon. Written by Terrance Dicks. Televised as the Monster of Peladon. Teleplay by Terrance Dicks from a story by Brian Hales. Screen credit to Brian Hales. Televised in March and April 1974. Published in December 1980. Cover artist Steve Kyte. 50 years after his first visit to Peladon, the Doctor returns to find that Queen Thalira has inherited a troubled kingdom from her father. Membership of the Galactic Federation was expected to bring peace and prosperity to the planet, but the spirit of the sacred monster Agador is once more spreading terror and death. The Doctor uncovers a treacherous plot to steal the mineral wealth of Peladon, and is again confronted by his old enemies, the Ice Warriors. We're already at the last novelization of 1980, and the last book, really, of the Terrance Dicks era. As I discussed last week, episode 61, in the context of the Horns of Nimon novelization, season 17 is the last TV season, in production order, where more than half of the novelizations will be written by Terrance. And as Joe and I discussed earlier in the program, 1980 is the last calendar year where Terrance writes at least half the books. So 1980 ends on a high note, our first novelization of a Third Doctor, Jon Pertwee story, in well over 2 years. And it's a story where Terrance was the script editor, and a bit more than that, as we'll see in a minute. This is not Terrance's final Pertwee era novelization, not by a long shot, but it is his last one as Target's #1 author. We have talked a lot about Terrance on this show between episodes 4 and episode 62, and we'll be talking a lot less about him over the next 2 years, which is about how much time this podcast has left, assuming I stick to my weekly schedule. I am going to miss him. I'm going to miss him a lot. By the time the novelization of The Monster of Peladon came out, many things had changed since the parent TV story aired over 6 years earlier. The credited episode writer, Brian Hales, was already dead. Of course, as we now know from story archives and the DVD release info text, Hales wasn't really the author of what aired on TV. Terrance relieved Hales after the obligatory 3 unsuccessful drafts and wrote the final version himself over Christmas break 1973. If you recall, Terrance had to do a similar thing with Brian Hales' second Ice Warrior story, The Seeds of Death, 5 seasons earlier. This makes Terrance the stepfather of Monster of Peladon, and makes him the perfect choice to novelize it, the way that Brian Hales had been the perfect choice to novelize The Curse of Peladon much earlier in the Target line. This was Terrance's 10th and final novelization of 1980, which is, by the way, wow, 9 books we've discussed here, and the 1 junior novelization that we are not covering. As far as the TV version of Monster of Peladon goes, it's an oddly paced story, with lots of seams showing, which is what happens when the guy who pitched the episode can't quite get it to work, and the already very busy script editor, who's also presumably working on his own robot, which came up next in the production order, as well as the early novelizations, has to do the rewrites. Minor characters come and go from the narrative at odd times. Vega Nexos is given a big build-up, and then killed halfway through Part 1. Preba also gets a big build-up, isn't in Part 3 at all, and then dies in Part 4, his role in the narrative instantly taken over by a different Pel Minor, who himself is killed off a few more scenes later. The first half of Part 1 is also a furious bit of exposition, trying to remind the audience, in just a few minutes, what we learned 2 seasons earlier, during all of The Curse of Peladon. I mean, imagine being a casual fan watching this in 1974, more than 2 years after the original, and trying to make sense of this.
The sooner we can achieve full production of trisilicate, the sooner we can bring this dreadful war to a successful conclusion. Thank you, Ambassador. The audience is at an end. Thank you, Your Majesty.
Your Majesty, I must protest. I can control this situation. I do not want you exposed to danger.
You know as well as I, Ultron. It was my father's dream to see Peladon a civilized planet, a full member of the Federation. He signed the treaty. We must honor it.
I intend that we should do so. From the day Chancellor Hepesh died, I served your father loyally. I worked for the things he believed in. Progress, civilization, the Federation. Now there is war with Galaxy 5, and our people have to make sacrifices.
Yes, but in a quarrel not their own.
We have to accept the duties of Federation membership, as well as the benefits. Almighty Agador, make known your will. Do not seek vengeance on your servants. Let your judgment fall on those who have truly offended thee. The Citadel of Peladon, Sarah. One of the most interesting.
Oh, no, it isn't. Is it, Doctor?
No, not exactly.
No, it's not your precious citadel at all. It's another rotten, gloomy old tunnel.
Man, that went by a lot faster than I remember it. For the novelization, Terrance appears to be, as usual, writing from the camera scripts, which would have been a co-production between his final story draft and director Lenny Main. So a few last-minute changes that made it to TV are not reflected in the book. That line you just heard about Peladon accepting the duties of Federation membership, as well as its benefits, is delivered by Queen Thalira in the book, which suits the character, but got delivered by Ortron on TV, which doesn't suit the character. There's that frustrating moment in Part 1 on TV where Eckersley, the story's eventual human traitor, warns Vega Nexos not to approach the glowing red light, and then curses after Nexos is killed. Wait, what does that mean? Why did he warn Nexos? Why was he upset when Nexos died? This implies that Nexos' death was not part of Eckersley's schemes. It was a dreadful accident. But both Eckersley's pre-death warning and post-death curse are not in the novelization. This could have been an opportunity to explain what in retrospect is a rather confusing plot point, and could have added some characterization to Eckersley, but in the end, it's just not there. The book does benefit from Terrance otherwise having time to explain away bits of a rush job script that didn't quite work. Part 1, as we've heard, starts off with a furious blizzard of exposition, meant to catch us up on what happened on Peladon 2 seasons earlier. Terrance adds a page and a half of virtual prologue to start Chapter 1, recapping Curse of Peladon, before adapting the first half of Part 1 of Monster in the same chapter, where all that information is recapped again. This impromptu prologue helps us make sense of the scripted exposition, and makes the book a little easier to digest. Apart from changes to the televised episodes, there's also the operational art of Terrance Dicks. Terrance likes to use weird and strange as adjectives, and while he often gets flack for not adding much to the scripts, he really does, with constant asides and observations. The anti-Terrance naysayers perhaps don't appreciate how well he sets a mood in such a little space. Here are some examples. The Doctor sighed. Sometimes he felt he couldn't take his eyes off the universe for a moment, without it getting into trouble. Here's another one. Sarah went over to Eckersley. Something about his relaxed casualness appealed to her, and she couldn't see herself chatting with that octopus thing. Terrance also adds a one-sentence explanation as to how Gebek, in the Part 2 material, knows how to operate the sonic cannon, effortlessly filling in a plot hole, but not wasting a word to do so. Apart from the prologue material, the book is a bit short on exposition, and short on lengthy internal monologues, which you might find in a proper full-length novel. The Part 2 material, for example, takes up just 18 pages out of the book. But we've already read by this point Brian Hales's adjective choke novelization of Curse, and this one, honestly, is just an easier read. Less atmospheric, yes, but also technically much more adept. Quote, "The flames from the altar lamps illuminated the savage face of Agador with a lurid glow, so that the features seemed to writhe and snarl." That's a good line. In the Curse of Peladon novelization, would have been about 6 or 7 sentences longer just to convey the same point. Although Terrance doesn't comment much on the stunt performing as it happens, Terrance in all of his books enjoys a good political dust-up, and gets off a characteristically sharp one-liner. Having gained a major point, Ortron was prepared to concede a minor one. And Terrance's introduction of the Ice Warriors at the end of Chapter 6 is his usual excellent word economy, a 5-sentence paragraph, 4 of them starting with the word it or its. almost like found poetry. I don't know if this was the original scripted plan or Terrance embellishing the camera scripts, but the Chapter 12 climax works much better than on TV, which was more like 20 minutes of anticlimax. On television, as Axier, the Ice Lord, the evil Ice Lord, kills Skell by accident, and then is stabbed to death by an extra. In the book, Axier and Skell shoot each other simultaneously, which is much better. Battle Royale style, or Quentin Tarantino, for those of you who have not seen Battle Royale. And Terrance uses one of his trademark satiric parentheticals to cover the plot hole of what happened to the Ice Warrior's ship, which was still orbiting the planet, ready to blast it into dust. Open parentheses, quote, the crew of Azixir's ship had been monitoring the battle on their scanners. Gathering their commander had been defeated, they had prudently taken themselves off. Close quote. Close parentheses.
Sarah, why don't you stay and have a few words with the Queen? I have an idea you could give her some good advice.
What advice did the doctor mean? Well, it's going to be rather difficult to explain, but I think he was referring to women's lib. And what's that? Women's liberation, Your Majesty. On Earth, it means, well, very briefly, it means that we women don't let men push us around.
It's not like that on Peladon. The ruler is always a man. I was only crowned because my father had no son. It's Autran who holds the real power.
Well, and if you let him, you've just got to stand up for yourself.
It would be different if I was a man. But I'm only a girl.
Now, just a minute. There's nothing only about being a girl, Your Majesty. Never mind why they made you a queen. The fact is you are the queen, so just you jolly well let them know it.
On TV, skipping ahead from part 3 to part 6, Sarah's final words to Thalira were, "There's nothing only about being a minor, Your Majesty, any more there was about being a girl." Awesome words, right? Calls back to that earlier speech we just heard. But those words are not in the novelization. Also missing is Thalira's clever intuition that the Doctor is about to leave without saying goodbye. Monster of Peladon is by Terrance, so of course it's well written, and it fixes a couple of slight issues with the TV serial while glossing over some others. But it's also missing some good stuff too. It's a slightly above-average adaptation of a strictly average story. Even Terrance's run-of-the-mill stuff is excellent. It's by no means his best, which, fortunately, there's a lot more of Terrance's best yet to come. We're just going to have to wait a little bit longer than usual. Next week on Doctor Who Literature, 1981. Such a strange year. The first year of Ronald Reagan's American presidency, the fallout from which we're still dealing with today. The Major League Baseball season was disrupted by a strike, which erased 50 days of the schedule, and resulted in a convoluted playoff format in which the two best teams in the National League, Cincinnati and St. Louis, somehow did not qualify. Why did the strike last 50 days? Because the owners had 50 days worth of strike insurance. That's why. Anyway, it made for an odd baseball season, but other podcasts can tell you more about that. The analogy to my show is that 1981 was also a truncated year for Target. Only 3 Doctor Who novelizations came out. 3! Only 1 starring the 4th Doctor, and only 1 by Terrance. Next week, I'm rejoined by one of my most popular and golden-throated guests. As we return to the 4th Doctor, we return to Season 17, and we return to, well, we call it the Pit. Doctor Who and the creature from the Pit. Next week. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Special thanks to my special guest, Joe Short. Joe, sorry about the truncated interview. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels. My old tweets about the entire series under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's DrWho Pilgrimage. My current Twilight Zone watch-through nearing the end of Season 2 under hashtag TZPilgrimage, and on email at DoctorWhoLiterature, that's drwholiterature at gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.